This is about ethnographic mapping in London. My name's Jane Clossick, and as Jamie kindly introduced me, I'm a member of the Cities Research Group at London Metropolitan University. And I enjoyed the abstracts that was shared with me, and it seemed appropriate to give an overview of the PhD research that I undertook from until 2016. And I'm going to show you what I did in terms of ethnographic methods. I'm going to talk about what I found through studying the city with ethnography and anthropology and mapping. And then finally, I'm going to talk about why I think it matters to think about the city in terms of time and space, and to use the kind of methods which I am continually testing. So the first section is what I did. And I'm roughly, each of these, what I did, what I found, and why it matters, is roughly a third, hopefully, of this talk. So this piece of research was focused around Tottenham High Road in North London. And I studied the whole of the High Road in some ways, but I worked at multiple different scales because, of course, any chunk of city is so immensely complicated that you can't possibly hope to investigate every square inch of it. The only way to do it is to investigate fragments. So I investigated 3 chunks of Tottenham High Road: Morrison Yard, which is an ancient yard from the, maybe it's not that ancient actually, considering what we've just seen from Dagmar. It's quite old, maybe 200 years it's been there. And the Grove Business Centre, which I'm not going to talk about today, but that's what I looked at, and a Quaker meeting house and burial ground. Again, I'm mainly going to talk about Morrison Yard today. And I used multiple different methods, and they were all very time consuming. I used participant observation. I used graphic anthropology, and I did lots of interviews with different people who were using and walking around in these spaces. And I mapped and made plans of different places with. And I did these activities I actually worked at 4 scales, but I skipped the city scale for this presentation, which I'm glad actually now I've seen Dagmar's presentation, because I think it fits well to zoom in. I worked at block scale, building scale, and at the scale of the room or the person. And the thesis was called "The Depth Structure of a London High Street, a Study in Urban Order." And if you want to read it, you can. It's there, available in the repository at London Metropolitan University. So I'm going to talk through these 3 different methods and at the 3 different scales, and give you examples of the type of mapping which I used. In terms of participant observation, I hung around in places on the high street, and I participated in ordinary everyday high street activities. And I'm fascinated by Dagmar's categorization of 4 different types of space. And I did wonder, what is a shop? But we can talk about that later. Is it a club or is it private? And I chatted to people and I participated in local activities. I got my legs waxed. You can have a lot of very intimate chats while you're having your legs waxed. More tricky for men. Sorry, Jamie. I think you can get stuff waxed though as a man. I also joined the Quakers, and I used the high street for shopping, and I started lots of conversations with people to see what would come up. And it was through these encounters that both I identified what was appropriate to put in the maps and how I found interview participants. I used graphic anthropology, which is an emerging field, and it's great for architectural research. And one of the great things about it is it doesn't have clear boundaries and definitions, but largely it's about experiencing things and then drawing them in a way that seems right for the phenomena in question. So I interviewed people, and then I mapped out the stories they told me. And this, for example, is Sally's life and includes the grocery shop that she visits every day and the choir practice that she goes to weekly and her favourite restaurant, supermarket, and her daughter's school. And it's a tricky question of how do you integrate temporality into mappings of this type? And there are lots of ways to do it. And in this example, I just used different sorts of dotted line to show whether Sally was moving on this trajectory on a daily basis or just occasionally. Another way, of course, you could do it would be through layering. But then it's another question and another lecture, but what's the function of the mapping? Is the function of the mapping to communicate your findings, or is the function of the mapping an investigative tool? And I think how you map will depend on that function. And then at block, so that was the graphic anthropology aspect, and then mapping different phenomena in a detailed way. This is an example of a plan of the market hall, which is at the southern end of Tottenham High Road. And combined with interview data and personal experiences, I was able to get a very deep insight into what mattered most about all different types of places along Tottenham High Road, because the very act of mapping, it's an interpretive act and it shows you what's important a lot of the time. And then at the three scales, I worked at the scale of the block. So this is Morrison Yard, the yard I was describing to you earlier. And the entrance to the yard is just here. And here is the yard itself. And it's surrounded by non-residential buildings. It's incredibly complicated and dense. There's a Citizens Advice Bureau, which is a place for free legal advice, shops on the frontage facing the high road. And I was able to see how these different types of uses related to the main public street. And it was clear that the uses which needed visual contact and footfall tended to be situated near the high road. It's not a unique finding, but it's through mapping it and looking at the relationships that you can start to see urban patterns. And here's a more detailed drawing of Morrison Yard showing the room and person scale. Sorry, showing the building scale. And all along the front here, this is the shops facing the high road. This is an Islamic school. This is there's a catering business. This is the Citizens Advice Bureau, and this is a huge bakery on the ground floor, and then multiple other smaller businesses on upper floors. And all of that is accessed through this small entranceway here. And then at the person or the room scale, this bakery is situated here. And Tottenham has a massive population of Turkish immigrants. So this is a key indicator of the local culture. And it has a front area, which is more public, with public tables. And that's used a bit like a living room, really, or a public house for local residents, mainly men, Turkish men, who come in and sit in these tables and drink tea and eat little pastries. And then simultaneously at the back, there'll be busy activity making large quantities of baklava for parties or events. And those two things are happening simultaneously, the stuff that's happening here at the back and here at the front. But in here, people might be speaking Turkish and be very culturally specific. That's where the family sits. And then here, and much more private. And then here, this is where people will be speaking English mostly, especially if I'm in there, then people speak English to me. And that's a gradation of publicness from front to back. And that's very important for the effective functioning of a city, which is super diverse and multicultural, to be able to accommodate very culturally specific activities and then more convivial activities towards the most common to all area of the city. So a few thoughts on the methods that I used, or the methodology that I approached investigating Tottenham High Road with. And that is, I just followed my intuition and my personal presence in the place. I was always present. My presence would always impact the conversations and the perceptions, but it's your responsibility as an ethnographer to talk to people and not always to rely on your own interpretation of a situation. Mapping and drawing at any scale tends to show what's important in a situation, because making drawing is an act of interpretation. Ethnographic mapping is a creative act, I think, also, which is both a pro and a con. It's a conversation between the researcher who's present and the situation that she's experiencing. Part of the success, I think, of an ethnographic mapping approach is that you have to be there for some time in order to make it successful. You have to observe and participate, and being there enables you to build relationships with both people and place. And then the timescales and temporalities of different aspects of any urban environment are many and varied. Some things happen every day, some things only happen weekly, some things only happen over decades or centuries. So Morrison Yard, for example, has been there for centuries, but the shutters on the bakery will open and close every day. And those small details are what make up the complex and interactive place ballet that is the city. So my key finding was urban depth and depth structure. So all the drawings I've shown you so far, I'd say, are of urban depth, the term which describes the contents of buildings, city blocks and neighbourhoods in their entirety, so including architectural, economic and social aspects. And how this urban depth is structured, I think it has the following components. I think it has zones. So I think the space is differentiated into zones which are characterized by different norms of decorum, privacy and access. So think, for example, about the bakery. The decorum in the front is very different to the decorum in the back. Implicit awareness of these zones and the boundaries between them coordinates where people go and what they do in urban space, both individually and collectively. And I'm now going to talk in more detail about one example that I explored on Tottenham High Road. And what I'm trying to do is to create useful concepts for designers, so you can understand this underlying structure and understand how you can then apply that when you want to do anything with space and architecture, but particularly if you want to design it. So here's a diagram showing this urban depth on each side of the high road. Crazy Cut is a salon a bit north of the bakery, but still within the same block. And the salon is a single bay. It's about 5 meters wide and it's about 8 meters deep, painted bright orange inside. And here's a plan of Crazy Cut. And here's a drawing of the inside, downstairs and upstairs. And I think it was quite clear in experiencing this shop when I walked through the front door that there were these distinctive zones within the plan. And the objects that mark the thresholds to these zones were also quite clear. So, for example, here in the front is the waiting area. There's the sofa that people sit on, and there's the reception desk. And here, there's a shelving unit placed strategically in the middle of the floor that demarcates the edge of that zone. And then further in, this is where people get their hair done, is the washing sink. And here at the back is completely private. This is the kitchen. And you can see here the key elements which communicate what the depth structure is, and that is the objects at the boundaries of each zone. So in this case, the reception desk, and in this case, the shelves, the zones themselves, so the kitchen, central area, reception desk area, and the waiting area. And here are some photographs that show you what I'm talking about. So in this zone of waiting, the decorous activities might include arriving or making an appointment, speaking to the receptionist, waiting to be seen on the sofa. And it might be expected that you speak quietly and look presentable. And people allowed in this spot would be staff and clients who've signed into reception. Slightly deeper into the depth structure, we've got hairdressing and eyebrow styling. Chatting more informally might be acceptable. And some bodily contact for the sake of hairdressing is welcome. And then even deeper here at the back in the kitchen, private activities would take place. So staff making phone calls, speaking in Turkish, again, it's a Turkish-owned business, making lunch and eating your lunch. And the people allowed in there would only be the staff. And I got invited in there to undertake an interview with the person who's organising the salon. And then between these zones, there's different types of boundary, and those are permeable in different ways. You might be able to see through them, or you might be able to move through them. And the ease of crossing that boundary may also be socially demarcated. So it might also be that there are boundaries that you just need to have certain personal characteristics to cross into. So these were the insights that I came up with through the process of ethnographic mapping. Oh, here's a nice slide which shows the difference between the shelves in the front of house and the shelves in the kitchen. So this shelf on the left is the one that demarcates the difference between the waiting area and the central salon. And on the right-hand side, that's the shelf in the private area of the kitchen. So there's lots of signs and signals that communicate to everybody what is the function of the place and who's allowed in there. And most of the time, it feels like we, if not agree, then at least we adhere to these rules. And I think these decorum indicators are very culturally specific. So I'm not sure, and I haven't done this research, I'm not sure to what extent people would be able to fully read the decorum and boundary indicators in other cultures. That's the next thing I'd like to research. But I think the general structure of depth structure with zones is true, certainly in London, and it's certainly true at a range of different scales. So this is a diagram of a typical depth structure, which has these three components. It has zones, thresholds, and boundary objects, and decorum indicators. So it's this system of social territories, and that contains and reproduces the knowledge which allow us to spatially cooperate across very large numbers of people who don't know each other. And this depth structure is both created by the architecture and objects, but also it's reinforced by those architecture and objects, and at the same time the architecture and objects create it. So it's a constant reciprocal reinforcement. And one of the key aspects of this, as you expand it into a larger scale, is that within the depth of a block or within the depth of a building, the scope of what's possible becomes greater. So you can have a lot more cultural specificity. You can actually have quite nasty things. You can have racism, and you can have, I don't know, a private boxing club or somewhere you can fight dogs, all of that kind of thing. If it's hidden within the depth of the block, it's the depth which allows activities which might be considered to be aggressive or difficult or non-convivial to take place in the city, but without meaning that we're all constantly in conflict with each other. And I think, although I've looked at this depth structure and the interior of the hairdressers, I think the ideas about these key elements of depth structure actually extend up to the scale of a whole block and potentially up to the scale of a city. But again, that's another aspect of the research that I haven't done yet. And why does it matter to think about depth structure in this way and to understand the difference between the front of urban depth and the middle of urban depth? Why does it matter for designers or other people who want to use space? So I'm now going to talk about two consultation projects that took place in the London Borough of Southwark in 2018. And thinking about urban depth, you might consider a building, you might consider it in terms of its position in the street network, its position in the urban block, the type of signage it has, the location of its entrances, which barriers there might be, the thresholds and boundary objects, how open it is to the street, thinking back to the different types of permeability within urban depth, and how is the relevant knowledge communicated of what is happening within that building. So, for example, in Crazy Cut, the hairdressers, it's very clear what's happening because there's a great big glass window. You can see people getting their hair cut. If you want to have a haircut, it's fairly clear that that's where you need to go. So this is the Old Kent Road, which is in South London, about 6 miles away from Tottenham High Road, which is in North London. And this image shows all the businesses in the Old Kent Road opportunity area. So the opportunity area is a district defined in the London plan in which 20,000 new homes are intended to be built with schools, open spaces, public realm, etc. But there are an awful lot of businesses likely to be displaced by this development project. And in 2018, according to our research, only 14% of those businesses had been contacted by the London Borough of Southwark. So Southwark held a business engagement consultation event. And considering the number of businesses who would be affected, who are going to be or are already being affected by this policy change, it seemed really significant and important to us that they should be given a proper opportunity to engage in consultation. So the Southwark business meeting took place here in the New Covenant Church. And this was the event that was organised by Southwark Council. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you about an event that we organised as a way of comparing these two in light of the knowledge of urban depth. And you can see this building, although it's very spatially accessible on the main road, there's absolutely no visual connection into the depth of this building to see what was happening. So the bookshop is at the front, and behind that was a hall where the meeting took place, and you couldn't see it, and there was no sign. So people didn't know it was happening. And 45 people attended out of 9,500 business employees. And I think that if you analyse this in terms of its urban depth, you can understand why it had such poor attendance. So the position in the urban block is excellent. It's at the front, but there was no signage. The door entrance was not clearly marked because it looks like a bookshop. There are several thresholds to cross in order to get to the hall at the back. And earlier I mentioned there might be social boundaries, and I think there's quite a strong social boundary probably for a lot of people entering this church building. By comparison, we held a business consultation meeting in number 231 Old Kent Road, and we wanted to try and rectify the mistakes and actively engage some of the business owners locally. So ours was much more spatially accessible from the main road because it's a shop and it has a big open shop window, so you could clearly see what was happening inside. Had a single threshold, and from a social point of view, that shop threshold is much more commonly crossed by most people. People are used to walking into shops. And we had 3 times the attendance, 150 people attended. Here's a tweet, which I think shows in a pleasant way what jolly activities we undertook at this workshop. So I think it's our ethical responsibility as built environment professionals to ensure that the city is accessible. And to do that, we need to understand depth structure. And this is a complicated and interesting issue, because it's not always going to be the case that we want everything to be hugely accessible to all people. And this is where Dagmar's spatial categorization or typology was so fascinating, because it's a design of boundary objects and thresholds and a design of the social structures around any kind of organization, which dictate into which of those 4 spatial categories any public space will fall, or private, because any space is somewhere on the gradation between completely private and completely public. But nonetheless, I think it's our responsibility to note the level of accessibility that we want to design, and that in order to design it, we have to understand the depth structure. And again, I think looking at Dagmar's work, it's fascinating to think of the different types of depth structure which have been in place historically, and how did those relationships work between for some reason I'm seeing Jamie and he's laughing, and I didn't say anything funny, so I'm like, oh no, he's not listening, he's chatting away. To recap, or I'm just hilarious all the time, that's also good. To recap, I think as an ethnographic researcher, you need to follow your nose. The researcher is always there, and it takes place over time, and you need time to talk to people. It's the act of mapping that shows what's important, and it's a creative act. Being there is extremely valuable, and noticing the different times and temporalities that the events of a place ballet occupy. It really matters to designers of events and buildings and experiences and social relationships. It really matters where things are in the network of streets and within the urban block. It really matters what kind of signage exists and what sorts of information is available to people interacting with cities, where the locations and entrances and what sort of barriers might exist for people. And I think it's the ethical responsibility of designers to understand the accessibility of what they've designed. I think it's an interesting way to expand the notion of accessibility beyond accessible places for physically disabled people or physically differently abled people. I think understanding depth structure is a really important part of the social model of disability, and understanding it is really important in terms of thinking about accessibility on a much more wide-ranging scale. And I think as designers, we really have to understand depth structure. And I came to understand it through ethnographic mapping. And that's why ethnographic mapping is really important. So I really enjoyed talking to you. And I've written a book, which is free to download and has some of these ideas. I actually haven't written a book. I've edited a book, and lots of other people have written a book. But it's free to download, and it engages with these questions of inclusiveness on high street architecture in particular, or everyday street, because not every street is a high street. And it was co-authored with 2 other fabulous women, Agustina Martira and Birgit Hausleiner, who's actually from TU Delft. And that's free from UCL Press. It would be great if you could download it and enjoy it. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm always delighted to hear from anybody. That's my email address and my Twitter handle. Email's probably better. I'm not very active on Twitter. I do my best.